A horse only comes home alone for two reasons, old ranchers used to say. Either somebody died, or somebody is still running. Wade Bennett heard the slow dragging sound before dawn, somewhere beyond the windmill and the frozen fence line where the prairie disappeared into gray morning fog. At first he thought it was another loose shutter. The north wind had been mean all week, rattling the ranch house hard enough to wake old memories a man spent years trying to bury. But then came the sound again. Hooves. Uneven. Slow. Exhausted. Wade sat up in bed, every joint in his back complaining from a lifetime of saddle leather and cold mornings. For a long moment he didn't move. Men who lived alone learned not to rush toward noises in the dark. The room smelled like burned coffee and old cedar smoke. His coat hung beside the door exactly where he left it the night before. Nothing in the room had changed in months. Nothing ever did anymore. He reached for the lantern, thumbed the flame awake, and stepped out onto the porch in his long johns and boots, while the Wyoming wind sliced through him sharp as broken glass. The ranch stretched silent under the pale blue edge of sunrise. Empty corrals, frost-covered troughs, snow drifted against the lower fence rails. And standing beside the main gate with steam rolling off its body into the freezing air was Ghost. Wade froze so completely the lantern trembled once in his hand. The white-gray stallion looked thinner than he remembered. Dirt streaked its flanks. One rein dragged in the snow. The saddle hung crooked like it had been thrown on in darkness by shaking hands. Ghost lifted his head slowly when he saw Wade, and the horse let out a tired breath that floated into the cold like smoke from a dying fire. "No," Wade whispered before he realized he'd spoken aloud. A month. 31 days since the horse thieves hit the north pasture during the storm and vanished with 6 of his best horses. Men from 3 counties helped him search the canyons the first week. By the second week, most stopped talking about it. By the third, folks in town had already started using words like shame and bad luck and too old to rebuild. Wade had stopped riding out after day 22. There came a point when hope cost more than grief. He walked toward Ghost carefully, boots crunching over frozen dirt. The stallion did not move away. That hurt worse somehow. Ghost used to rear at strangers and nip any fool dumb enough to grab his bridle wrong. Now the horse just stood there tired enough to sleep standing up. Wade's gloved hand touched the animal's neck and paused there. Cold, trembling. Beneath the dirt and sweat he could feel every rib. Lord above. Wade breathed. Then he saw the blood. Not much. Just dark stains dried stiff across the saddle leather near the horn. Wade's eyes narrowed. His hand moved lower. Rope burns along the side straps. One stirrup twisted backward. And under the saddle blanket, half hidden beneath frozen mud, marks that looked painfully close to old iron chain scrapes. Ghost suddenly jerked his head toward the barn. Not wild. Not frightened. Urgent. Wade frowned. Easy now. The horse pulled again, low and impatient in his throat. Wade followed reluctantly through the drifting snow toward the backside of the stable, where old hay bales sat stacked shoulder high against the wall. The wind moved differently there. Blocked. Quieter. Ghost stopped beside the hay and stamped once hard enough to shake frost from the fence post. Wade lifted the lantern higher. At first he saw nothing except shadow and bundled canvas. Then the canvas moved. Small. Weak. Human. Wade's jaw tightened instantly. A boy no older than 8 sat curled against the hay with both arms wrapped around a woman lying beside him beneath an old wool blanket stiff with frost. The child's face was pale from cold and exhaustion, but his eyes snapped wide open the second he saw Wade. And before Wade could say a single word, the boy raised a revolver in both shaking hands and pointed it straight at his chest. Wade did not reach for his gun. Men who survived long enough out in Wyoming learned something important sooner or later. A frightened child holding a weapon was not the same thing as a dangerous man holding one. The boy's hands shook too hard to steady the revolver properly anyway. The barrel trembled left and right while the freezing wind pushed through the barn slats behind him. Still, Wade stopped where he was. Slow. Careful. The lantern glow flickered across the boy's face, revealing dirt streaked under one eye and lips pale from cold. Easy there, son, Wade said quietly. I am not looking to hurt anybody. The child swallowed hard but did not lower the gun. Do not send us back. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence, dry and weak like he had not used it much in days. Wade looked down at the woman lying motionless beneath the blanket. One side of her coat was soaked dark near the shoulder. Not fresh blood. Older. Dried stiff from travel. Her blonde hair stuck out beneath the blanket in tangled strands damp with melted frost. She looked young from a distance. Up close, she looked exhausted enough to collapse into the earth itself. Ghost stepped closer behind Wade and lowered his head toward the woman with a low rumble deep in his chest. The horse had always hated strangers. Wade once saw the stallion throw a ranch hand into a water trough just for yanking the reins too hard. But now Ghost stood beside the woman like a guard dog too tired to bark. Wade narrowed his eyes slightly. That bothered him. "What is your name?" Wade asked the boy. The child hesitated. The revolver dipped an inch before he forced it back up. "Samuel." "All right, Samuel. Mine is Wade Bennett. This is my ranch. That horse belongs here." Samuel glanced toward Ghost immediately, fingers tightening around the revolver grip. "He brought us." Wade studied him quietly. 8 years old maybe. Thin enough his coat hung loose around the shoulders. There were dark circles under his eyes that no child ought to carry. The kind that came from nights spent awake too long listening for footsteps outside. Wade slowly crouched down into the snow, making himself smaller. Less threatening. "How long has your mother been unconscious?" Samuel's mouth moved, but no sound came out at first. Then softly, almost ashamed of it, he whispered, "Since yesterday afternoon." Wade looked at the woman again. Frost clung to the edge of her sleeve. Her breathing was shallow enough, he almost missed it. One gloved hand rested protectively across her stomach even now, like her body refused to stop guarding the child beside her. "She's sick?" Wade asked. Samuel shook his head. "She fell off the horse one time near the river." Ghost shifted uneasily at the mention of the river. Wade noticed that too. The stallion's ears flattened briefly before turning toward the distant hills north of the ranch. The same direction the horse thieves disappeared a month ago. Wade felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "How far did you ride?" Wade asked carefully. Samuel blinked at him through exhaustion. "I do not know." "Days." The boy nodded once. Ghost kept walking after dark. The horse lowered his head slightly, as though hearing his own name. Wade let out a slow breath through his nose. Snow began drifting harder now, tiny white streaks twisting through the barn doorway. Another hour out here, and the woman might not wake at all. Samuel's hands were trembling worse by the second. Not from fear anymore. From cold. Wade noticed the boy had wrapped strips of old cloth around his fingers beneath the revolver grip because he did not own proper gloves. One strip had frozen stiff with blood where the skin cracked open from the weather. Wade carefully set the lantern down beside the hay bale. "Samuel," he said softly, "I need to get your mother inside near the stove." The boy immediately raised the revolver higher again. Panic flooded his face so quickly it hurt to look at. "No, son, no." His voice broke this time. Real fear. "Please." Wade stayed still. The wind groaned outside through the old fence line. Somewhere beyond the pasture, a loose chain knocked softly against wood. Samuel's eyes darted toward every sound. Listening. Waiting. Like he expected riders to appear any minute from the dark. Then Wade noticed something else. Tracks, fresh ones. Not theirs. Half covered by blowing snow near the backside of the barn. Wade stared at the tracks for a long moment without speaking. Snow had already begun swallowing the edges, but not enough. Whoever made them had come through recently. One horse. Maybe two. Hard to tell with the wind covering the trail. But the direction was clear. The prince stopped near the back of the stable and circled once before turning away toward the cottonwoods east of the ranch. Wade slowly looked back at Samuel. The boy saw it in his face immediately. Fear tightened every inch of him. "They found us," he whispered. Ghost suddenly lifted his head high and let out a sharp, uneasy snort toward the darkness beyond the pasture fence. Wade stood up carefully, joints stiff from the cold. "How many?" Samuel shook his head quickly. "I do not know." "You saw somebody?" The boy hesitated too long. Wade noticed. Children who had spent too much time scared learned to measure every answer before speaking. "Samuel." The child swallowed hard. "Last night near the river I heard horses behind us." "How far behind?" "Far enough Mama thought we could still make it here." Wade narrowed his eyes. "Here. Not town. Not the sheriff. Here specifically. That's that wrong with him." "Your mother know this ranch?" Samuel nodded once. "She said if Ghost kept going north he would bring us to a safe place." Wade felt that strange, cold feeling settle deeper into his chest. He had not sold Ghost. Nobody outside 3 counties should have known where the stallion belonged. Yet somehow this woman had trusted the horse to lead her here through miles of winter country. Ghost stamped again and shifted closer to the woman protectively. Wade looked down at her pale face. Frost still clung to the ends of her hair. Her lips had lost almost all color now. Whatever was chasing them would not matter much if she froze to death first. Wade rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. He already knew what decent men were supposed to do. The problem was decent men usually paid for it. Every single time. He looked back toward the open pasture where the first weak streaks of dawn stretched over the snowfields. A month ago, this ranch held 12 horses for ranch hands and enough noise to keep silence away. Then the thieves came during the blizzard. By spring, the hands left one by one after Wade could no longer afford them. Now the place sounded empty even when the wind blew. He had grown used to that emptiness. Trusted it. Silence could not betray a man. Silence could not disappear overnight. Ghost nudged Wade hard enough in the shoulder to break the thought apart. Wade glanced at the stallion irritably. You always did have rotten timing. The horse lowered his head toward Clara again. Samuel's hands trembled harder around the revolver. He was trying not to cry now. Wade could tell. The child kept pressing his lips tight every few seconds like he thought tears were something dangerous. Mama said not to trust men with clean coats, Samuel whispered suddenly. Wade looked down at his old canvas ranch coat, stained with mud near the cuffs, and laughed once through his nose before he could stop himself. It had been weeks since any sound close to laughter escaped him. Samuel blinked in confusion. Well, Wade muttered. Good thing I do not own one then. The boy did not smile back. He looked too tired to remember how. Wade crouched slowly beside Clara and pressed 2 fingers carefully near her neck. Weak pulse. Fast. Her skin felt cold even through the gloves. Not dying yet, but close enough a storm like this could finish the job before noon. Wade glanced toward the house nearly 50 yards away through blowing snow. Warm stove. Dry blankets. Coffee probably burnt by now. Safe walls. He had spent years protecting that silence from other people's trouble. Letting strangers inside again felt like opening a door he barely survived closing the first time. Then Clara moved faintly beneath the blanket. Just enough to murmur something broken and weak against the cold. Wade leaned closer to hear it. Do not let them take him. Samuel's eyes shut tight the moment he heard her voice. Relief crossed his face so suddenly it made him look younger than 8 for half a second. Just a little boy again. Not some frightened thing hiding behind a revolver in the dark. Wade looked at the child, then at Ghost standing guard over both of them like the horse had already made the decision for everyone. Wade let out one long, tired breath into the freezing air. All right, he said quietly. We are getting your mother inside. Samuel's eyes widened instantly. You promise? Wade looked toward the fading tracks near the trees one more time before answering. No, he said honestly. But I reckon I am too old to ignore trouble once it shows up in my barn. The ranch house smelled like cedar smoke, old coffee, and the kind of loneliness that settled into wood after too many winters without laughter. Wade pushed the front door open with his shoulder while snow chased him in across the floorboards. Ghost stayed close behind, carrying the smell of sweat and frozen leather into the warm air. Samuel stepped inside carefully without lowering the revolver completely. The boy's eyes moved fast across the room, searching every shadow, every doorway, every window. Wade noticed that too. Children raised safe did not enter houses like hunted animals. Set her near the stove, Samuel whispered quickly. She gets cold fast now. Wade nodded once. All right. He laid Clara carefully onto the old couch near the iron stove while heat crackled softly through the room. Up close, she looked even worse. Her skin carried that pale, exhausted color people got after too many sleepless nights and too little food. There was mud dried into the hem of her coat, and one boot laced tied together with twine where the leather snapped sometime during the ride north. Wade pulled another blanket from the bedroom and draped it over her slowly. Samuel stood less than 2 feet away, watching every movement like he expected the world to change its mind at any second. Ghost stopped near the doorway and remained there instead of wandering toward the barn. That unsettled Wade more than he wanted to admit. Horses remembered danger long after men pretended to forget it. Wade moved toward the stove and poured water into a blackened kettle while the room filled with the soft whistle of warming metal. How long since either of you ate? He asked. Samuel hesitated. Yesterday morning, maybe. Wade looked at him over his shoulder. Maybe. Not even sure anymore. He opened the cupboard beside the stove. Beans. Half a loaf of hard bread. Dried venison hanging from cloth near the window. Enough for one man through winter if he stretched it careful. Enough for 3 people if the weather stayed kind. Outside, the wind howled harder against the porch roof. Like it already knew kindness was not coming. Wade tore the bread slowly and handed one piece toward Samuel. The boy stared at it first instead of taking it. You can eat it, Wade said. Samuel looked down at the revolver still clutched in his hands. His cheeks reddened slightly with embarrassment before he carefully tucked the gun into the back of his belt and accepted the bread with both hands. Small hands, chapped raw from cold. He ate too fast at first, then slowed himself down like somebody had once taught him not to trust hunger. Wade watched quietly while cutting venison near the stove. Your mama teach you that? Samuel looked confused. Teach me what? How not to eat too fast after going hungry. The boy lowered his eyes toward the floorboards. She said sick people throw food back up if they rush. Wade nodded once. Smart woman then. Clara stirred faintly beneath the blankets before coughing weakly into her sleeve. Samuel was beside her instantly. Mama. His voice changed completely around her. Softer. Younger. Clara's eyelids fluttered open slowly against the firelight. Fear hit her face first before recognition did. Her eyes snapped toward Wade near the stove, then toward the windows, then the door. Measuring exits. Measuring danger. Easy, Wade said quietly. You are safe enough for now. Clara tried sitting upright too quickly and winced hard from pain near her shoulder. Samuel grabbed her hand immediately. Mama, it is all right. The horse brought us here. Her eyes moved toward Ghost standing near the doorway. The stallion stared back silently. Something fragile crossed Clara's face then. Relief maybe. Or disbelief. Wade handed her a tin cup of warm water. Drink slow. Clara hesitated before accepting it. Even exhausted, she still watched him carefully over the rim. Thank you, she whispered. Her voice sounded rough from cold air and too many miles. Wade leaned back against the counter quietly studying her. You know my horse. Clara's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. Too slight for most people to notice. Wade noticed. I know of him, she answered carefully. That is not the same thing. Silence settled over the room except for the stove popping softly. Samuel looked nervously between them. Ghost shifted once near the doorway and lowered his head toward the floorboards. Wade followed the horse's gaze automatically. Something small rested tangled beneath the saddle straps, hanging loose near Ghost's side. Wade stepped closer and pulled it free slowly. A piece of black leather about the size of his palm, burned around one edge, stamped with a faded cattle brand he had not seen in 15 years. The second Wade recognized it, every warmth in the room disappeared. Clara saw his face change instantly. Her own expression drained white. Samuel looked up in confusion while Wade stared silently at the old symbol burned into the leather. A circle crossed by 3 crooked lines. The mark of the Mercer gang. For a long moment nobody in the room moved. The stove crackled softly beside the wall while snow tapped against the windows in thin, icy waves. Wade stood near Ghost holding the burned leather piece between his fingers like it might suddenly disappear if he blinked wrong. 15 years. 15 years since he last saw that brand burned onto anything. Men stopped speaking the Mercer gang's name out loud after a while. Same way folks stopped mentioning graveyards after dark. Time buried things. Or pretended to. Clara slowly lowered the tin cup into her lap. Her knuckles had gone white around the metal. Samuel looked between them quietly, confused by the silence. What is it? He asked softly. Wade did not answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the symbol. 3 crooked lines crossing a circle, burned deep into the leather years ago by somebody who wanted the world to know fear belonged to them. Finally Wade spoke without looking up. Where did you get this? Clara's breathing became uneven. Small. Tight. Like every answer carried a price she could not afford anymore. It was tied under the saddle when we found Ghost. Wade lifted his eyes slowly toward her. Found him where? Clara hesitated again. Too long. Wade noticed Samuel watching her now. The boy knew she was hiding something too. That hurt him worse than the cold ever could. Near Casper Ridge, Clara whispered finally. Wade's jaw tightened instantly. Casper Ridge sat nearly 60 miles east through rough winter country. Old mining land. Half abandoned. Half forgotten. Not a place people wandered into by accident. Ghost shifted uneasily near the doorway. The stallion's ears flattened the moment Clara spoke the ridge's name. Wade noticed that too. Horses remembered places tied to fear. There is nothing left near Casper Ridge except empty mines and bad memories, Wade muttered. Clara stared down into the untouched water in her cup. That is not true anymore. The room fell quiet again. Samuel pulled the blanket higher around his mother's shoulders while Wade slowly walked toward the window. Outside, the ranch sat buried beneath snow and pale dawn light. Empty corrals stretched behind the barn, where his missing horses once stood stamping and breathing steam into the mornings. He could almost hear them sometimes when the wind moved right. Ghost used to lead them all. Strongest horse in the valley. Smart enough to open gates if a latch sat loose. Mean enough to bite strangers and loyal enough to follow Wade through river crossings no sane animal should attempt in winter. Then the thieves came during the blizzard and took half Wade's life with them. He had spent 31 nights convincing himself Ghost was dead because grieving hurt less than hoping. Now the horse stood 20 feet behind him while the Mercer brand rested in his hand like a ghost dug out of old dirt. Wade closed his eyes briefly. His younger brother Eli used to chase Mercer men across 3 territories before the gang vanished. One spring morning 15 years ago, Eli rode out and never came back. Wade buried an empty coffin because there was nothing else to bury. Folks said time healed things after enough winters passed. Folks lied. Mama. Samuel's small voice pulled Wade from the memory. Clara looked down at her son immediately. What is it? Should we leave? The question hit the room harder than shouting would have. Samuel asked it carefully, like he already expected the answer to hurt. Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. Wade turned slowly from the window. The boy sat curled beside his mother with frost still melting from his boots onto the floorboards. 8 years old and already asking people if they wanted him gone. Something about that settled heavily inside Wade's chest. Ghost suddenly lifted his head toward the front porch. One sharp snort. Low. Warning. Wade looked toward the door instantly. Clara stiffened beneath the blanket. Samuel grabbed the revolver from beside the couch, so fast it was clear this was not the first time fear interrupted a quiet room. Then came the sound. Faint. Almost buried beneath the storm outside. Horse hooves somewhere beyond the ranch fence. The sound came again through the storm. Slow hoofbeats somewhere beyond the cottonwoods east of the barn. Not close enough to see yet. Just close enough to make the room stop breathing. Samuel slid off the couch immediately and crouched low beside his mother with the revolver clutched in both hands again. Clara grabbed his sleeve fast. No, she whispered sharply. Do not point that unless you have to. The boy looked up at her with frightened eyes. What if it is them? Clara did not answer right away. That silence answered enough. Wade moved toward the rifle hanging above the fireplace without rushing. The old Winchester felt cold and familiar in his hands. He checked the chamber automatically while listening to the storm outside. Ghost remained fixed beside the door with every muscle tight beneath his pale coat. The horse's ears stayed locked toward the eastern fence line. Waiting. Wade trusted that more than most men's opinions. Stay here, he said quietly. Samuel shook his head instantly. Do not leave us. The fear in the child's voice hit harder this time because it came out exhausted instead of panicked. Like he had already spent every ounce of strength being afraid and still could not stop. Wade looked at him for a long moment. Then toward Clara. She sat upright now despite the pain near her shoulder, one hand protectively resting against Samuel's back. Her eyes carried the same look Wade saw in wounded animals during winter storms. Not weakness. Readiness. The kind that came from surviving too long without help. I am only checking the fence, Wade said calmly. Door stays barred. Behind me. Nobody opens it unless they hear my voice. Clara slowly nodded once. Wade pulled on his coat and stepped onto the porch while the storm slapped freezing wind against his face hard enough to sting his eyes. Snow blew sideways across the yard now. The weak dawn had disappeared behind heavy gray clouds rolling down from the mountains. Wade moved down the porch steps carefully, boots sinking into fresh drifts while Ghost followed close behind without being asked. The ranch looked different in storm light. Smaller somehow. More exposed. Wade reached the split-rail fence near the water trough and paused to listen. Nothing at first except wind rattling dry branches together. Then faintly through the storm came another sound. Metal. Loose tack jingling softly somewhere among the trees. Wade narrowed his eyes toward the cottonwoods. Hard to see much through blowing snow. But there. A shape moving slowly between the trunks. One rider. Maybe. Wade crouched beside the fence automatically, while Ghost stood perfectly still beside him. The stallion's breath rolled white into the freezing air. Easy now, Wade murmured under his breath. The shape moved closer through the trees before suddenly stopping. Wade could barely make out horse and rider both. Dark coat, wide hat, sitting still in the storm like they were studying the ranch. Watching. A bad feeling crawled slowly up Wade's spine. Then the rider turned away. Just like that. Vanished back into the snow without approaching another yard closer. Wade remained crouched for several long seconds after the figure disappeared. His fingers tightened slightly around the rifle stock. Most folks knocked on doors during storms. Men who watched houses from tree lines usually had reasons not to. Ghost let out a low, uneasy rumble deep in his chest. Wade slowly stood again. Near the fence post, he noticed fresh tracks half buried beneath drifting snow. Deep prints. Heavy horse. Recent. He followed them with his eyes toward the trees until something small caught near the lower wire fence stopped him. Cloth. Wade stepped closer carefully and pulled the scrap free. Dark blue fabric torn from a coat sleeve. Wet with melted snow. 1. Edge looked ripped recently on barbed wire. Wade turned the cloth over once in his hand before freezing completely. Stitched into the corner sat the same crooked circle brand from the leather piece inside. Smaller this time. Sewn in black thread. Mercer. Wade stared toward the trees again while cold wind pushed through his coat seams. 15 years gone, and somehow the ghosts found his ranch anyway. Behind him, the house windows glowed softly against the storm. Warm light. One frightened woman. One exhausted child. And somehow all of it now sat directly in the path of something Wade spent half his life trying to forget. Ghost nudged his shoulder once, restless and impatient. Wade looked down at the stallion. You knew, did you not? He muttered quietly. The horse flicked one ear toward the house. Wade followed the movement automatically. Through the frosted window, he could see Samuel standing on the couch, peering nervously outside, while Clara pulled the curtain partly shut beside him. The boy looked small against the storm. Too small for the kind of fear sitting in his eyes. Wade stood there another long moment listening to the wind before finally turning back toward the porch. But halfway to the house, he stopped again. Near the barn door, barely visible beneath fresh snow, sat another set of tracks leading away from the ranch. Much smaller. Child-sized. Wade crouched slowly beside the smaller tracks while snow drifted across the barnyard around him. They were old enough to soften at the edges, but not gone completely. Small boots. Child-sized for certain. The prints came from behind the barn, crossed the frozen yard, then disappeared near the eastern fence where the rider had been watching from the trees. Wade stared at them for a long moment without moving. One child inside his house. Another child's tracks outside his barn. His stomach tightened. Ghost lowered his head beside him and sniffed the snow near the prints before pulling back uneasily. The stallion knew something too. Wade stood slowly and looked toward the dark tree line again. Nothing there now except storm and blowing white. But somebody had been close enough to watch the ranch. Close enough to leave tracks. He turned toward the porch fast after that. The front door opened before he reached it. Samuel stood there wrapped in one of Wade's old wool blankets with the revolver still tucked awkwardly into the waistband of his pants. Mama said you were gone too long, the boy whispered nervously. Wade stepped inside quickly and barred the door behind him while warmth hit his face in soft waves from the stove. Clara sat upright now at the edge of the couch despite how pale she looked. She searched his face the second he entered. Someone was out there. It was not a question. Wade tossed the torn blue cloth onto the table beside her. Clara's face drained of color the instant she saw the stitched Mercer symbol. Samuel looked between them anxiously. Who are they? Clara closed her eyes briefly before answering. Bad men. Samuel frowned. You always say that. Because it is true. Her voice cracked slightly from exhaustion. Wade pulled off his gloves slowly. You are going to tell me exactly what happened near Casper Ridge. Clara looked down toward her hands. The room stayed quiet except for wind pressing against the walls outside. Finally, she spoke softly enough Wade almost missed the first words. My husband worked the silver tunnels east of Casper Ridge before the mines shut down. Wade remained standing beside the stove listening carefully. Last spring some men came through offering work. Good money. Cash every Friday. Men around there were hungry enough not to ask questions. Clara's fingers tightened together. My husband thought it meant we could finally leave the mining camp. Samuel lowered his eyes toward the floor, like he already knew the story and hated every part of it. But the work was not mining, Clara whispered. It was horses. Wade's jaw tightened immediately. Clara saw it and nodded once. Stolen horses, hidden in the lower tunnels where nobody traveled anymore. The fire cracked softly in the silence after that. Wade felt old anger stirring awake somewhere deep beneath years of dust and quiet. Clara continued carefully. At first Daniel only fed them and cleaned stalls. Then he realized children were there too. Wade looked up. Sharply. Children. Samuel pulled the blanket tighter around himself. Clara nodded slowly. Runaways. Orphans. Some taken from camps farther south. The gang used them because children fit through collapsed tunnel spaces easier than grown men. Wade stared at her without speaking. Outside, the storm rattled the porch roof hard enough to shake loose snow from the beams. Clara's voice dropped lower. Daniel wanted us gone the second he understood what kind of men he worked for. She swallowed hard before continuing. 3 weeks ago, he helped 2 children escape through one of the old drainage shafts. Samuel shut his eyes tightly beside her. Clara reached for his hand automatically. The Mercer men found out. She stopped there. Did not explain further. She did not need to. Wade understood enough from the look in her face. Men like Mercer did not forgive betrayal kindly. And Ghost? Wade asked quietly. Clara looked toward the horse standing near the doorway. Your horse was already there when Daniel found the hidden corrals. They kept him locked underground because he was worth too much to sell quickly. Wade felt his chest tighten unexpectedly hearing that. Ghost flicked one ear toward Clara's voice, but stayed silent. Daniel said the horse fought every man who touched him. Clara whispered faintly. Except children. Samuel finally spoke again, very softly. Ghost let the little girl braid his mane. Wade looked toward him immediately. What little girl? The room went still. Samuel realized too late what he had said. Clara's eyes shut briefly in pain. Wade stared between them both, while cold settled heavily through the warm room again. Samuel's voice became almost too quiet to hear. We were not alone when we escaped. The fire popped softly in the stove while nobody in the room spoke for several long seconds. Wade stood completely still near the table watching Samuel carefully now. The boy sat wrapped in the wool blanket with his head lowered like he wished he could pull the words back out of the air. Clara closed her eyes briefly before looking toward Wade again. Her name is Ellie, she whispered. Ghost shifted near the doorway at the sound of the name. The horse lowered his head slowly and let out a soft breath through his nose. Samuel looked toward the stallion immediately. He misses her too. Wade felt something tighten painfully behind his ribs hearing that come from a child's mouth so naturally. Missing people should have belonged to old men and widows, not little boys. Clara rubbed one shaking hand against her forehead before continuing. She was 7 years old, maybe 8. Daniel found her in one of the lower storage tunnels with 2 other children last month. Wade pulled out a chair near the stove and sat slowly for the first time since dawn. The old wood creaked beneath his weight. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the ranch house windows. Snow hissed across the glass in restless waves. Where did the children come from? Wade asked quietly. Clara stared into the fire while answering. Different places. Mining camps. Rail towns. Orphan wagons moving west. Some were runaways. Some. Her voice faltered slightly. Some were simply never searched for hard enough. Samuel's fingers twisted tightly in the edge of the blanket. Ellie said the tunnels felt like graves. Wade looked at him carefully. You knew her long? Samuel nodded once. She shared her bread with me the first night. The boy swallowed hard before continuing. She was not scared of Ghost either. Ghost flicked one ear again at the sound of his name. Wade listened quietly while old anger stirred heavier in his chest now. The Mercer gang stealing horses was one thing. Men had been stealing horses since before Wyoming had fences. But children hidden underground, like forgotten supplies, twisted something darker inside him. Clara drew a slow breath. Daniel spent weeks planning how to get us out. He believed if we could free Ghost first, the horse would survive the mountain trails better than the others. Wade glanced toward the stallion, standing silently near the doorway. Ghost looked thinner than he remembered, but still carried that same steady, dangerous calm in his eyes. Clara continued softly. Ellie helped us. She distracted one of the guards while Daniel opened the lower gate. Samuel suddenly spoke without lifting his eyes. She gave me her scarf because my hands would not stop shaking. Wade noticed then the faded blue cloth wrapped around Samuel's wrist beneath the blanket. Child-sized, carefully tied. Clara's voice broke slightly now. We were supposed to come back for her after reaching the ridge trail. Wade already knew from the silence afterward that they never did. Samuel pressed both hands hard against his face suddenly, tiny shoulders trembling beneath the blanket while he fought to stay quiet. Clara pulled him close immediately despite the pain in her shoulder. Sammy. The boy shook his head hard against her coat. She waited for us. The words came out small and broken. She waited, and we never came back. Wade looked away toward the stove because something about hearing guilt inside a child's voice sat wrong in the deepest part of him. Samuel should have been worrying about schoolbooks and fishing lines and muddy boots, not whether another child got left behind in frozen tunnels. Ghost stepped closer to the couch slowly until his large pale head rested near Samuel's shoulder. The boy reached toward the horse automatically, without even looking up. Tiny fingers buried themselves gently into the stallion's mane. Ghost stayed perfectly still. Wade stared at that quietly. Ghost barely tolerated grown men touching him most days. But now the stallion stood beside the frightened child like a patient old guardian. Clara looked up toward Wade again with exhaustion sitting heavy beneath her eyes. The Mercer men realized we escaped before sunrise. Daniel stayed behind long enough to give us time to reach the North Trail. She stopped there again. Another silence full of things nobody wanted spoken aloud. Wade understood enough. The storm groaned against the roof overhead while the firelight flickered softly across the room. Then suddenly Ghost jerked his head toward the back window hard enough to rattle the chair beside him. Wade turned instantly. Outside beyond the snow-covered barn, something moved near the eastern fence line again. A lantern, small and distant, swinging slowly through the storm. The lantern moved slowly beyond the fence line, like somebody searching through the storm without wanting to be seen too quickly. Wade stood from the table at once. Ghost's muscles tightened near the doorway, and the stallion let out a low warning sound deep in his throat. Samuel looked toward the back window with fear rising all over his face again. Clara grabbed his arm immediately. Stay away from the glass. Her voice came out sharper this time. Not panic. Experience. Wade lifted the curtain corners slightly with 2 fingers and stared into the storm. The lantern swung once between the trees before disappearing behind blowing snow, then reappearing farther north. Slow. Deliberate, following the fence line, watching the ranch. Wade lowered the curtain carefully. They are checking the property. Samuel's breathing became uneven beside the couch. How many? Wade shook his head once. Only saw one light. Clara looked toward the rifle still resting near the stove. There will be more. Nobody argued with that. The storm outside carried the kind of silence that made bad things feel close even before they arrived. Wade moved toward the back room and opened an old cedar cabinet beside the kitchen wall. Inside sat boxes of rifle shells, oilcloth, 2 lanterns, and a revolver he had not touched in nearly 4 years. Dust covered the handle. Wade stared at it quietly for a long moment before lifting it from the shelf. Samuel watched him carefully. You do not like guns much, the boy whispered. Wade checked the cylinder automatically while answering. I like trouble less. Ghost shifted near the doorway and stamped once against the floorboards. The horse kept glancing toward the backside of the house now instead of the front. Wade noticed that immediately. What is it? He muttered under his breath. The stallion snorted sharply and turned his head again toward the rear kitchen wall. Wade frowned. Then he heard it too. Faint. Very faint beneath the storm. A scraping sound. Metal against wood somewhere outside near the back porch. Clara stood instantly despite the pain in her shoulder. Samuel moved beside her, clutching the blanket around himself. Wade raised one hand, quietly signaling silence while he stepped toward the kitchen window. The scraping stopped immediately. Snow hissed softly outside against the porch roof. Nothing else. Wade waited another 5 seconds before slowly opening the back door 2 inches. Freezing wind rushed inside, carrying snowflakes and darkness with it. He listened carefully. Nothing. Then Ghost suddenly lunged forward hard enough to nearly knock the kitchen table sideways. The stallion shoved his head through the doorway with ears pinned flat and let out a furious cry into the storm. Somewhere beyond the porch came the sharp sound of running footsteps disappearing fast through snow. Wade pushed the door open wider and stepped outside with the revolver drawn low beside his leg. Snow whipped across the yard so thick he could barely see the barn anymore. But near the back porch steps fresh tracks, cut sharply away from the house toward the eastern trees. Human. Running. Wade followed them 3 steps before stopping suddenly. Something rested half-buried beside the porch post. Small. Cloth. Wade bent slowly and picked it up. A child's scarf. Faded blue wool with loose stitching near one edge. Samuel appeared behind him in the doorway before Wade could stop him. The second the boy saw the scarf, his entire face changed. Ellie. The word barely came out louder than the storm. Samuel stumbled down the porch step toward Wade without even noticing the cold. Tiny shaking hands reached for the scarf immediately. That is hers. Wade looked down at the worn fabric carefully now. One corner had been tied into a small knot around something hidden inside. Samuel untied it with trembling fingers. A silver button rolled gently into his palm. Old. Tarnished. Stamped with the outline of a mining lantern. Clara appeared behind them, wrapped tightly in the blanket, pale from exhaustion and fear both. The second she saw the button, she stopped breathing for half a heartbeat. Daniel's coat, she whispered. Wade looked up sharply. Samuel stared at the button while snow gathered slowly in his hair and on his shoulders. She found Papa, he whispered. Ghost lowered his head beside the child quietly while the storm roared around them. Wade looked toward the dark eastern trees again where the lantern disappeared earlier. Somebody had come close enough to leave this on purpose. Not a warning exactly. Something worse. A message. The blue scarf stayed clenched tightly in Samuel's hands long after they stepped back inside the ranch house. Snow melted slowly from the wool onto the floorboards near the stove while the storm deepened outside. Clara sat at the table, now staring at the silver button resting in her palm, like it might suddenly speak if she waited long enough. Wade shut the curtains across every window before adding more wood to the fire. The room glowed warmer after that, but the warmth no longer reached anyone properly. Ghost remained near the back door, restless and alert. The stallion had not fully relaxed once since arriving home. Wade noticed every little thing about it now. The way Ghost kept listening toward the eastern fence line. The way his ears moved whenever the wind carried distant sounds. Horses survived because they trusted fear faster than people did. Samuel finally spoke without lifting his eyes from the scarf. Ellie used to wear this every day. Clara swallowed hard beside him. Sammy. She said blue made her easier to find in the dark. The boy's voice cracked near the end. Wade looked away toward the stove again. He knew enough about grief to recognize when it started changing shape inside someone. Children blamed themselves for things adults could barely survive understanding. That kind of guilt stayed too long once it settled in. Clara closed her fingers tightly around the silver button. Daniel would not have given this away unless he wanted us to know something. Wade nodded slowly. Or somebody wanted you to think he did. Clara looked up sharply. The thought hit her hard because it already lived somewhere inside her. Wade sat down across from her at the table, revolver resting quietly near his elbow. Tell me about Casper Ridge. Clara stared into the firelight for several seconds before answering. The old mining camp sits beneath the northern cliffs about 10 miles east of the Ridge Trail. Most people abandoned it after the silver dried up. But Mercer stayed. Clara nodded once. The lower tunnels connect through old ventilation shafts, hidden corrals underground, storage rooms, places nobody checks anymore because half the mountain is unstable. Samuel slowly rubbed one thumb across the scarf fabric while listening. Wade studied the child carefully. The boy had not let go of that scarf once. Ellie still there? Wade asked quietly. Samuel's eyes filled immediately, though he fought hard against it. She was supposed to meet us by the North River crossing. Clara looked toward Wade. The storm hit before dawn. Daniel pushed us ahead with Ghost because he said the trails would disappear under snow. Her voice softened painfully. He stayed behind long enough to cover the tunnel entrance. Wade already knew what kind of choice that was. Men stayed behind for people they loved when they understood they might not ride out afterward. Clara stared down at the button again. Ellie promised she would bring Daniel once the tunnels cleared. Silence settled over the room after that. Wade listened to the wind hammering against the walls while old memories pressed quietly at the back of his mind. 15 years ago, Eli Bennett rode after Mercer men because somebody needed to stop them. Wade buried what came back of that decision for the rest of his life. He had sworn never again. Never chase ghosts. Never ride toward trouble just because nobody else would. The ranch was supposed to be the end of all that. Quiet mornings. Horses. Distance from other people's pain. Then Ghost came home carrying strangers and old scars both. Ghost suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the front porch. 3 slow knocks echoed through the house. Everybody froze instantly. Samuel's face drained white again. Clara stood so quickly her chair scraped harshly against the floorboards. Wade reached for the revolver at once. Another knock came through the storm. Slow, heavy, patient. Then a man's voice carried faintly through the wind outside. Mr. Bennett. Wade narrowed his eyes immediately. He knew that voice. Deputy Harold Pike from the town south of the ridge. Old, careful, usually harmless. But Harold Pike should not have known strangers were hiding here. Clara saw Wade's expression change. Who is it? Wade did not answer immediately. His eyes moved slowly toward the eastern windows instead. Ghost stared toward the front door now with ears pinned flat against his skull. The horse did not trust the voice outside at all. The knocking came a third time. Slow enough to sound polite. Heavy enough to feel wrong. Wade stood near the table with the revolver resting low beside his leg, while Ghost stared toward the front door with every muscle tight beneath his pale coat. Samuel had backed halfway behind Clara, now clutching Ellie's scarf against his chest like it could somehow keep the storm outside from reaching him. Wade looked toward Clara carefully. Take the boy into the back room. Clara hesitated. Wade. Now. Something in his voice made her listen. She took Samuel gently by the shoulder and led him toward the narrow hallway near the bedroom, while the child kept looking back over his shoulder toward the front door. Ghost watched them disappear before turning his attention forward again. Another gust of snow rattled the porch windows hard enough to shake frost loose from the corners. Mr. Bennett, Harold Pike called again through the storm. You in there? Wade moved toward the door slowly and stopped beside the window first. He pulled the curtain edge aside barely an inch. Deputy Pike stood on the porch bundled in a thick winter coat with snow piled across the shoulders. One lantern swung in his gloved hand. Behind him, near the hitching rail, sat a dark horse breathing steam into the freezing air. No second rider visible. No extra horses. Still, something about the deputy's posture felt strained tonight. Too stiff. Too careful. Wade opened the door halfway, without lowering the revolver completely. Cold wind spilled inside immediately. Pike looked older than Wade remembered. Gray beard coated with melting snow. Tired eyes sunk deep from too many winters. But beneath all that exhaustion sat something else tonight. Nervousness. Evening, Wade. Pike muttered quietly. Bit rough out for visitors. Wade kept one hand on the door. What brings you this far north in a storm? Pike glanced once over his shoulder toward the darkness beyond the ranch yard before. Answering. Town got word somebody might be heading this direction from Casper Ridge. Wade's face stayed perfectly still. That's so. Pike nodded slowly. 3 riders came through yesterday asking questions. Looking for a woman and child. Inside the hallway, Clara had gone completely silent. Wade knew she was listening from the shadows. Pike lowered his voice carefully. Folks in town got uneasy when they mentioned Mercer. Ghost suddenly stamped once against the floorboards behind Wade hard enough to make Pike glance inside. The deputy's eyes landed on the pale stallion instantly. Surprise crossed his face before he could hide it. Lord above, Pike whispered. Ghost really did come home. Wade watched him closely now. How did you know that? Pike hesitated 1 second too long. Wind pushed snow across the porch between them. Word travels. Wade's jaw tightened slightly. Nobody from the ranch had ridden into town. Nobody should have known about Ghost except whoever watched the property earlier. Pike noticed the shift in Wade's expression immediately. Easy now, he muttered softly. I did not come here for trouble. Then why are you here? Pike rubbed one gloved hand across his beard slowly. Because Mercer men are moving again. First time in years. His eyes moved toward the dark ranch yard. And because somebody in town told them your horse came back. Silence stretched between them. Wade felt the cold settling heavier beneath his ribs now. Who told them? Pike shook his head. Do not know yet. Ghost let out another low warning sound. Not toward Pike this time. Toward the darkness beyond the porch. Wade noticed instantly. So did Pike. The deputy slowly turned his head toward the eastern fields where snow drifted thick across the fence lines. "You hear that?" he whispered. Wade listened carefully. At first only wind. Then faintly beneath the storm came another sound. Horses. Several this time. Still distant, but coming closer. Pike's face tightened immediately. Damn. He stepped backward on the porch and lifted the lantern higher toward the storm. Tiny shapes moved far beyond the cottonwoods now. Dark riders barely visible through blowing snow. More than 2, maybe 4, maybe 5. Wade felt the old cold anger inside him wake fully for the first time in years. Pike looked toward him sharply. "They tracked me here." Inside the hallway, Samuel made a frightened sound too small to be called a cry. Ghost suddenly lunged forward to the doorway beside Wade with ears pinned flat and teeth bared toward the storm outside. And somewhere beyond the ranch fence a voice carried faintly through the wind. "We know they are inside." The room seemed to shrink after the voice came through the storm. Samuel pressed himself against Clara in the hallway while Ghost stood planted at the doorway beside Wade like the horse understood every word spoken outside. Deputy Pike stepped quickly into the house and shut the door hard against the wind. Snow swirled across the floorboards around his boots before the latch caught. "How many?" Wade asked quietly. Pike removed his gloves with stiff fingers. "I counted 4 riders near the east fence. Could be more hanging back in the storm." Clara's face had gone pale again. "They found us." Wade looked toward her sharply. "You said Mercer hid in tunnels because they stayed away from attention. Why ride straight onto a ranch?" Clara swallowed hard before answering. "Because they lost Ghost." Silence followed that. Wade understood immediately. Ghost was not just another stolen horse. The stallion was valuable enough men would risk exposure getting him back. Pike moved toward the window carefully and peeked through the curtain edge. "They are spreading out." Outside, the wind screamed across the ranch hard enough to rattle the porch roof. Faint shapes moved near the barn through curtains of snow. Slow. Patient. Not rushing. Men comfortable frightening people usually took their time with it. Samuel suddenly whispered from the hallway. "They do not want us. They want Ellie." Clara turned toward him instantly. "Sammy." But the boy kept going, words trembling now. Ellie heard things in the tunnels. She knew names. Wade looked carefully at the child. "What names?" Samuel hesitated before answering. "Railroad men. Town men too. Men paying Mercer to move children through the mountains." Deputy Pike's expression darkened immediately. "Lord help us." Wade stared toward the storm outside again while old instincts slowly woke inside him. This was bigger than horse theft. Bigger than one frightened family. Clara stepped carefully into the room, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "Mercer cannot let Ellie talk." Her voice broke slightly. "That is why they are hunting us so hard." Another sound echoed faintly outside then. Metal striking wood somewhere near the barn. Ghost jerked his head sharply toward it. Wade grabbed the lantern from the table at once. Pike moved beside him near the window. "Do not go out there alone." Wade's jaw tightened. "They are testing distance. Seeing how scared we are." Samuel looked up from the hallway quietly. "Ellie used to say bad men move slow when they think nobody can stop them." The words settled heavily into the room. Wade looked toward the child for a long moment. Samuel sat wrapped in an oversized blanket with Ellie's scarf still clutched tightly in both hands. Too young for this conversation. Too young to know fear this well. Yet somehow the boy already sounded older than most grown men Wade knew. Ghost stomped hard enough to shake the floorboards again. The horse suddenly turned away from the front door and moved quickly toward the back kitchen wall. Wade frowned. "What is it now?" Ghost lowered his head near the floorboards beside the pantry door and let out a sharp, uneasy breath. Wade crossed the room carefully and knelt beside the wall. At first he saw nothing except old wood and shadows. Then he noticed it. A faint draft slipping through the cracks near the floor. Pike crouched beside him immediately. "Cellar?" Wade nodded slowly. "Old root cellar under the kitchen." Clara looked up sharply. "Can it get outside?" Wade stared at the wall another second before answering. "Leads under the barn. My father built it during the hard winters." Samuel's eyes widened. Hope mixed dangerously with fear there. "We can leave." Wade stood slowly. Snow hammered against the house harder now, while distant horse sounds circled the ranch beyond the storm. Pike looked toward the windows uneasily. "You are not outriding them in this weather." Wade already knew that. Clara looked toward him carefully. "Then what do we do?" Wade did not answer immediately. His eyes moved around the room slowly. The old stove. The rifle above the fireplace. Ghost standing protectively near Samuel now. The frightened woman. The exhausted deputy. The child carrying another little girl's scarf like a promise he could not let go of. 15 years ago, Wade Bennett buried his brother because Mercer men rode wherever they pleased while good people stayed quiet behind locked doors. He had spent years convincing himself he was done fighting ghosts. But ghosts kept arriving anyway. Outside, another voice carried through the storm. Closer this time. You have got until sunrise, Bennett. Wade looked toward the dark windows while something cold and steady settled inside him at last. Then he reached up slowly and took the old Winchester rifle down from above the fireplace. Wade held the Winchester across both hands for a long moment, without speaking while the storm pressed against the ranch house from every direction. The old rifle looked heavier than Samuel expected somehow. Not because of the wood or steel, because of the silence wrapped around it. Clara stood near the stove, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders, while Deputy Pike watched the windows nervously for movement outside. Ghost remained beside Samuel, large pale body blocking the boy from the door like the horse had already decided exactly who belonged under his protection now. Another rider moved past the eastern window through blowing snow. Slow, watching, waiting for fear to do the work for them. Wade finally looked toward Pike. How long until sunrise? Pike glanced at the clock above the stove. Maybe 2 hours. Wade nodded once. Then he looked toward the old pantry wall covering the cellar entrance. That tunnel still opens behind the lower barn, past the frozen creek. Clara's eyes lifted toward him carefully. You are helping us leave. Wade stared toward the storm outside. I am helping the children leave. Samuel tightened both hands around Ellie's scarf hearing that. Clara opened her mouth like she wanted to argue before stopping herself. Outside, a horse snorted near the front fence. Too close now. Wade crossed the room and knelt beside the pantry wall, pulling aside an old flour barrel nobody touched anymore. Behind it sat a narrow wooden hatch almost invisible beneath years of dust and warped boards. Wade lifted it with a low groan of old hinges. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below. Samuel stepped closer slowly. It smells like dirt. Wade glanced toward him. Means it is still dry enough to use. Pike moved beside the opening, holding the lantern lower into the tunnel. Rough stone walls disappeared beneath the ranch house toward blackness. Old support beams crossed the ceiling every few feet. Clara looked uncertainly toward the narrow passage. How far does it run? Quarter mile maybe. Comes out near the creek bank behind the north pasture. Pike frowned immediately. That trail heads toward the ridge road. Wade nodded once. Exactly. Samuel looked up at him. You know where Ellie is. Wade did not answer immediately. The boy watched him quietly for several seconds before understanding settled slowly across his tired face. You are going there. Clara stepped forward at once. No. Wade looked toward her calmly. Those riders outside are buying time until daylight. Once the storm clears, they will search every inch of this ranch. Clara shook her head hard despite the pain in her shoulder. You do not owe us this. Wade almost smiled then, not because anything felt hopeful, because he remembered hearing those exact words years ago from his younger brother before Mercer men rode him into the ground. Some debts did not disappear simply because time passed. Maybe not, Wade muttered softly, but I reckon I owe somebody. Ghost suddenly walked toward the cellar opening and stopped beside it. The stallion lowered his head into the darkness before turning back toward Wade expectantly. Samuel stared at the horse. He wants to go too. Wade rubbed one tired hand across Ghost's neck. Course he does. Stubborn animal never learned how to stay out of trouble. Outside, another voice echoed through the storm closer than before. Sunrise is coming, Bennett. Pike moved toward the front window. Quickly. They are closing in. Wade looked toward Clara then. Really looked at her for the first time since dawn. Exhausted widow. Frozen hands. Eyes carrying too much grief for someone still young enough to hope. Beside her stood Samuel, clutching a little girl's scarf, like letting go of it would mean losing her forever. Wade understood something then that settled quietly but firmly inside him. Mercer men survived because people kept choosing safety over strangers. One family at a time. One frightened child at a time. Somebody finally had to choose differently. Wade handed Clara the lantern carefully. Tunnel stays straight until the split. Take the left path near the broken timber beam. Clara stared at him without moving. Wade. There is an old trapper cabin 5 miles north near Dry Creek. Wait there until sunset tomorrow. If I do not come." He stopped briefly before continuing. "Keep riding west." Samuel's eyes filled immediately. "You are coming back." Wade looked down at the boy quietly. Children always said things like that with more faith than the world deserved. Ghost nudged Samuel gently once before stepping toward Wade again. Pike checked his revolver beside the front door with shaking hands. "I will buy you time." Wade nodded once. Then he looked toward the dark tunnel beneath the house, toward the storm outside, toward the old ghosts waiting somewhere beyond Casper Ridge. 15 years ago, fear buried his brother. Tonight, it would not bury another child. Then suddenly from somewhere beyond the ranch came the distant sound of a little girl screaming through the wind.